Is SMITE dying? A conversation we last had almost a year ago, and since then a lot of things have changed. Ahoy, my name is SLOTH, and today we're looking at the current state of SMITE from quite a few different angles. The whole reason why I'm bringing this up again is A, it's almost been a year, and B, I've recently heard some conversation through Twitter, people talking about how a lot of people are dropping out of the game and maybe SMITE's just on the decline right now. And I figured, okay, that's a subjective feeling, but let's see what the actual data says. In order to do that, we're going to look into some different Steam data, as well as some YouTube data, some slight glance at the Instagram data, and a website called Gamstart. We're also going to briefly talk about Glassdoor and the competitive scene, and then we'll finish it off with a little bit of talk about high-risk future as a whole. One thing we will not look at this time is the Twitch data. And that's because Twitch stats are essentially useless at this point. You probably see some relatively good stats on Twitch overall, but that data would be misleading. On one hand, Scara and his friends played the other day, Miskiv has played not too long ago for a charity event, so those things skew the data a little bit. But more importantly, viewer points are on basically every channel now, and there are so many people that just go on channels, on Twitch channels for SMITE to get those drops. And I know that for a fact because I stream there occasionally now and I get way more viewers than I used to, but my chat isn't more active than it used to be, simply because a lot of people see that I'm online, see that I'm streaming, and they're like, okay, we just hop on your channel and we'll lurk there for viewer points, but we're not actually interested in watching SMITE or participating right now. And that's completely fine, but that means that the data that we have on Twitch now is completely uncomparable to anything that we used to have. And that brings us to the more interesting stuff. Let's have a look at how SMITE is doing on the SMITE game YouTube channel. I used to look at other channels as well, but I find that it's not really reflective of anything anymore, since there are so many new channels that are growing and then older channels that are declining and everything. So it doesn't really tell us the full story, but the SMITE game channel itself is unchanged in that regard. And here we can see that basically the growth is relatively stagnant. Because of the way that growth is measured now, you can't see small jumps as quickly, so you only see when the subscribers go up or down by 10k. But as you can see here in May, they lost 10k subscribers and they gained 20k, and that was last year, and since then there hasn't been an increase or decrease by 10,000 subscribers, so there really isn't any change here at all. Instagram paints a similar picture with around 1,000, 1,500 followers per month, which is really not a lot. There was a spike last year, we'll get to that in a little bit. We'll talk about that in the context of some other charts, but really overall there isn't a drastic increase here. The SMITE game Twitter is actually losing followers most of the time, so that's interesting as well. I think part of this is also because certain skin giveaways that used to happen don't happen anymore when you connect your accounts and stuff, so that may make people less interested in following those social media accounts. And then we have Gamstart.com, which used to track PS4 players as well as a little bit of the Xbox One player base, but unfortunately that is no longer updated since November 2020. So we have a good idea until like towards the end of last year, but after that we didn't get any further information. It is worth keeping in mind that the data on this website is an estimation. It's not quite correct, I think, but it's still interesting to have these numbers. So what we see here is that the total player count for SMITE is 8 million, but we had an increase of 130,000 players in the last month that it was measured. There were also 59,000 returning players. This is measured by players that have earned at least one trophy in the last month, so if they didn't earn a trophy, they would not count towards this. That means there were probably quite a few extra returning players on top of this. On the Xbox side of things, there was an estimation for roughly 460,000 monthly active users with 77,000 new players. Fortunately, I already tracked the stat once in the past, and it seems that the player numbers on Xbox specifically have gone down, at least around November. Since the last time I measured before that, it was at 570,000 estimated monthly active users, with almost twice as many new players at that point. But again, these numbers are based on trophies, so it could just be that more people have earned more trophies and more rarely get new trophies, so they don't get counted towards this. If we dive a little bit deeper into the PlayStation stats, you can see some more comparisons here. This is what we currently have, or at the last measured point, this is what we had. We had 3,200,000 players that earned at least one trophy and 34,000 accounts with nothing but SMITE. And on the other hand, the stats from roughly a year ago were 3.1 million players. So really not a big difference here at all. Seems like PlayStation had a very slight increase in players. So far it seems like at the last measured point, we had a very slight increase in players on PS4 and a slight decrease in players on the Xbox One. But nothing all too major. And what's also interesting is that last year I made a poll where I was trying to figure out how the player base is currently split. And from that poll, it looked like we pretty much have an even split between PC players, Xbox players, and PS4 players. Switch players, not so much. And this will be important a little bit later, we get back to this. What's also important is that I did some polls about the Steam client versus the standalone client, and we saw a push away from the standalone client towards Steam, where last year roughly 20% of players were still using the standalone client and everyone else was using SMITE on Steam. So I slightly modified and repeated this poll to see how the current numbers look. Keep in mind there are a lot of limitations to this. This is basically just a reflection of my YouTube audience, and it doesn't necessarily tell us everything about the whole player base. It's also kind of skewed in favor of PC, I think, since polls more easily show up on PC or on smartphones than they would on like a console app or something. So it's not 100% accurate for sure, but it gives us an idea of how things have shifted. And what we can see here are some significant changes. Xbox, PlayStation looking around the same as before anyways, but what seems to have increased is the portion of PC players, especially if we add together the number for Steam players and Epic or standalone client users. In that case, they make up 43% of this poll, which far outweighs both Xbox and PC individually. And this is very interesting for another reason as well, because if you remember, a while back I said it seems that Hi-Rez is very focused on the console versions of SMITE, since that's where most of the player base is now. Now for this year, they have specifically announced a UI overhaul that sounded like it's at least primarily coming to PC, probably to all platforms eventually, but PC is the one that would more urgently need a UI overhaul since it has the older UI. So them shifting their focus a little bit more towards the PC side of things would make sense to me, given that it seems like their PC player base is growing a little bit compared to the others. I know of quite a few people who have switched from console to PC for competitive reasons, even though some of them kept playing with their controllers. But what's also very interesting here are the individual PC statistics. The Epic Launcher only came around very recently and most people aren't exactly sold on Epic Launcher, so that one not having that many players is not a big surprise. But the standalone client seems to have lost more players. That's because Hi-Rez very actively pushes people towards the Steam version of the game, and there are various advantages to using Steam at this point. But there are obviously also disadvantages, so don't switch if the standalone client is working fine for you. But what we can see here is that now roughly 10% of the PC players are still using other means of playing SMITE, whereas roughly 90% are using SMITE on Steam. Reminder, last year this was 80% on Steam and 20% not on Steam. So what that means is if we look into the Steam stats and we see a 10% increase in players, that would effectively only mean that these are PC players that were already playing before and switched over to Steam. So in order to see growth, we'd need more than 10%. And boy, do we get more than 10%. This is a little bit of a look at a graph from early 2019 until now. And you can see a pretty significant spike, which happened just around March 2020. And that was because just about the whole world went into lockdown. And at the time I said I don't want to look at those stats yet because it doesn't really tell us anything at this point. We'll have to see how they hold up over time. And if we look into the numbers here, then I would say these numbers are holding up pretty well overall. We're looking at a 50% increase in active players between March and April 2020. And then we saw some slight decreases, 7% here, 3% there, 5% here, then a little bit of an increase and stuff like that, but nothing major in either direction until January 2021 with the new season, where we saw another spike with 20% new players and then another 8% in February. When comparing the current number of average players to February of last year, then we still see a 50% increase from roughly 10,000 players to roughly 15,000 players. So that obviously looks very good for SMITE and most certainly doesn't look like a dying game. But hold your horses here for a moment. Due to the lockdowns, pretty much all PC games have seen a pretty significant increase in player numbers. So is SMITE's success here actually a SMITE thing, or is it just generally more PC players that are playing games? Well, to answer that, we have to look at a few other games. First, let's take another Hi-Res game, Paladins. Here things are not looking too rosy. The blue line is Paladins and the green line is SMITE. SMITE's going up, Paladins going down. That is probably at least partially due to a loss of Paladins' competitive scene, and the game is still doing okay, but it's far from its previous peaks. It's just kind of dwindling down and just kind of caught itself recently, and I think will stabilize more now. But it by far has not been able to utilize its peak the same way that SMITE has. So what about some bigger fish out there? If we look at Dota 2, the total numbers of players here are obviously much higher, but how are the spikes that started after the lockdown? We can see a significant increase here around March 2020 as usual, and then for Dota things kind of dwindled down a little bit again. It didn't really stay anywhere near that peak. Counter-Strike's pattern actually looks a little bit closer to SMITE, but even here we saw a bigger drop-off of players in between and just a higher increase later on. Rainbow Six Siege could not hold up nearly as well and only recently had a hump. I'm assuming there was some competitive thing going on. Rocket League is a game that also looks somewhat similar to SMITE's curve, but also lost a fair bit more players towards the end. So really, out of all these games, it seems like SMITE is holding that wave from lockdowns by far the best. Again, it doesn't have the highest overall player numbers, so maybe it's a little bit easier to ride that wave. But overall, it seems like they're really capitalizing on the right things to keep players interested and keep that momentum going. Maybe this is partially because SMITE has a bit of a steeper learning curve and you have to invest more time to really understand the game first. And with lockdowns, people actually had time to learn the fundamentals and then started really enjoying the game and stuck with it. But obviously, we cannot underestimate Hi-Res' work going into this as well. I think last year has been an excellent year for guard releases, for hype releases especially, to keep people interested and to bring new players into the game. And this is something where I briefly want to bring up the Glassdoor reviews as well. Glassdoor is a website where you can review your employer and take it with a massive grain of salt because the reviews here cannot be vetted. Like, you can't actually check if these are employees of the company. But Hi-Res was infamous for having extremely negative reviews on that website for the most part. Maybe some of those were actually frustrated players, but they were at a very, very bad rating the last time I looked, at 2.2. And the approval of the CEO, Hi-Res Eris, was extremely low at the time. Now there's a different CEO, Stu is at the helm now, and the ratings have gone up very significantly to 4.1, which is a pretty good rating on that website. Now, I found at least one review claiming that other reviews are fake and that Hi-Res is trying to boost their rating on that website since they had such a bad reputation there. I can't verify either side here. I can't verify if the positive reviews are real, and I can't verify if this review claiming that the other ones are fake is real. I'm going to briefly show some of the reviews here and you can make up your own mind about it. What I think is consistent is that the criticisms that they are wording in those are things that I've already heard about before, and the positive aspects are things I've heard about before as well. So I think at least not all of these reviews seem to be completely out of nowhere. It doesn't mean that they have to be accurate either, because sometimes companies incentivize their employees to leave reviews in order to make themselves look better and reward employees if they leave very good reviews. And last but not least, in the Steam Best of 2020, SMITE is performing as it's always been. It's once again in the bronze category for sales, meaning they're making a decent amount of money with the game. What is different from previous years, when SMITE was also in bronze, is that Paladins doesn't show up anymore. But SMITE seems to be a little bit higher on the list, so I don't know if that means it's making a little bit more overall. That, however, may still be a concern for Hi-Res, because it might mean that they are making losses in other departments now. It might mean they're not earning enough with Paladins anymore, or not as much at least. Rogue Company might be a money sink at this point, because I don't think it's really making profits. It's not really picking up so far. So they're kind of very dependent on SMITE, and SMITE hasn't gone up from bronze to silver, for example, so it didn't massively increase its sales. But having looked at all the stats now and seeing how Hi-Res has been handling SMITE as of late, I do think that it's not dying at all at the moment. It's in fact doing very well. I don't think it's growing much right now either. I don't think there will be any further spikes unless something dramatic happens in the world again. For now, maybe something dramatic happens for SMITE in a good way as well, who knows. But I think SMITE will be around for quite a while at the current point, and we'll see how it develops further down the road and look at it again. I recently also had an idea how SMITE can really prepare for the future, which we'll talk about in an upcoming video very, very soon. In order to see that, like and subscribe or I will... Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That includes That Nick Walker, Donald Ryden, Melancholy Gengar, Durain Brennan, Lantern25Green, Zed the Undead, Nivitz Jr., Rawas, and everyone else listed right here. You guys are the best.